All right, it's time for our keynote speaker. Our presenter is Ron Schlecht from BTB Security. Ron is the founder and partner in the independent firm BTB Security. Ron founded BTB Security in 2006 after successfully developing and leading professional consulting teams and global security organizations. With 18 years in information security experience, Ron's background includes performing jobs in law enforcement, intelligence, and information security. And if you have any questions or needs, please let him know afterwards, because this man is a font of information about security. He'll be fielding some questions afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ron Schlecht.
Too much stuff in my hands. Take it away. Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Tom kind of talked me up a little bit more than probably deserve, but we'll see if I can answer some questions, talk about some of the things that are going on right now in the industry, probably very applicable to everyone here. Like Tom said, I'm going to try to allow some time for some questions. We'll do some questions and answers towards the end of this. If you can hold it, if there's something that you just can't contain yourself, you can shout it out. I might just completely ignore you, but hopefully you get something out of this. So just a little bit of background. I'm not trying to push any information on you, but just wanted to give you a little bit of background on the company. We've been around since 2006, located in Philadelphia, offices Chicago, Austin, Texas as well. Have coverage nationally. For us, we started the company back in 2006, like I said. A little bit of a different spin on things. So kind of all experts all the time, going beyond the basics, which is what BTB stands for. The folks that we have there, a little bit of a different mix of experience. Like Tom was saying, I have some background experience, and we'll get into that in a minute, but large consulting organizations, a lot of folks that are coming to us as CISOs, coming out of internal organizations, just I think a little bit of a different view, but we're very focused on technical information security. That's really where the expertise lies. There's only 3 partners, Brian Bailey out in Chicago, Chris McGinley in Philadelphia, and then myself, which I kind of go half and half, Philadelphia and Chicago. This is not a picture of me, but you can pretend that it is. Tom said I've changed dramatically since 1994, but a little bit about myself. I've been doing this for 18 years. This is the bulk of my career. I did have a couple different jobs. I worked contract intelligence for a while, law enforcement, did some consulting of my own, basically with the Big Four, and then I have worked as a CISO. Like I said, I've changed a little bit since then. Got corrective eye surgery, gained a little bit of weight, dropped the pocket protector, although I was trying to find one for today, but I don't have a pocket. So this is where it all starts, right? I like to talk about the once upon a time. We're going back to 1994, that picture of me, right? How many of you, before we get into this, have experienced or have clients that have experienced a breach? Okay. Everyone that raised their hand, that's good. Everyone else, you're all liars, right? Because it's happened. It's okay to admit that it's happened. How many of you have seen increased budgets in cybersecurity, though? Right? About the same show of hands. It kind of goes hand in hand with what we're seeing. And we start to talk about security and start to talk about the things that are happening, and everybody always wants to talk and jump right into the breaches, the latest breach. But once upon a time, and I know we've all been there, right? It was just a technology problem. The attacks that we saw required sophisticated actors. Everything that we heard about that was going on was, basically the stuff that movies were made of. At the time, or we'd like to think anyway, the government was at the top of their game. I talked about being in the industry for about 18 years. My Bible growing up at that time was the Rainbow book series. And anybody who's ever read that, it was basically all about security, and the government had put it out. And at the time, CFOs, finance, and regular non-nerds didn't have to worry about it because it just wasn't something that was top of mind for folks. Like I said, it was more of a technology problem. But as we've grown, right, we've seen more of these attacks. And now I'm sure, as Tom was doing that introduction, we talked about the things that are top of mind, right? Everything that you hear in the news. You can't go a week without hearing some story of a breach or something that's impactful to us as businesses or individuals. So again, taking a little bit of a step back, historically, we've always talked about threats in a little bit of a different mode, right? Thinking about terrorism. global terrorism, and this is actually a threat map from 2 months ago, just basically showing different terrorist threats from around the world. You can see there's things on here like bombings, shooters, threats, whatever it may be, like this. What you can't show, and I wish there was a way for me to click this and kind of get outside of this, if I can find it. You don't have internet connectivity, that's fine. I was going to show an interactive map that basically shows real-time attacks. So we're used to this as sort of the threats globally. We always talk about terrorism, and that was always top of mind, up until really about 5 years ago. Now what we see is those cyber threats and those cyber attacks, which, unlike this, where they can be tracked a little bit slower, you have that interactive map, and it's nonstop. You can see attacks happening in real time, and they're tracked that way. So you start to talk about who the actors are, and this is where it kind of gets interesting because it's all about, I always talk about perception and perspective. Russia, right? We've seen this talked about in the news too much. We're not going to get political here, but this is one of those actors that for years we saw kind of dabbling in our political system, but then also really targeting financial services and trying to do bad things, trying to get money out of the United States or extort companies or individuals. Then we have Japan, which is a little bit more interesting, right? It's a developed country. There's a lot of intellectual property that's targeted from a country like Japan. Thailand, kind of the same thing, although most of the intellectual property that's pulled out or that they try to exfiltrate is for different reasons. Spain's always kind of a surprising one for people when we talk about who the actors are, and these are the top 10 actors, just talking about cyber threats. India kind of makes sense, right? We've seen a lot of people outsourcing operations to India. We know it's a very large country. There's a lot of talent there, and the infrastructure can support things like cybersecurity attacks. South Korea, okay, well, they're kind of keeping up with their neighbors, right? So they have to have some sort of capability, and you would expect that based on the region. Brazil's another one. It's a large country. They're kind of you can see how it's broken up, right? Some continents, everybody has some actor in the game. Turkey is always another one that's a little bit surprising. The big thing here is that the laws in Turkey around cybersecurity or cyber attacks are so lax, and you'll see this through a couple different countries. It's where a lot of people flock to. That's actually why Spain's up on this list, because it's a great place to be a cyber criminal. This is the one that, like I said, it's all about perception and perspective. When you look at it independently, like we always want to think that we have no part in this. The United States doesn't take part in any cyber attacks. We're number 2 on the list, and whether that's all via the government or private, it's hard to say. It's very hard to cut up whether it's the government-sponsored stuff or just rogue hackers kind of carrying this stuff out. But usually when I get to number 2, people are like, oh, wait, we're on that list. And then the one that's not surprising, because it's talked about so much in the news, is China. The point in putting this up for me is that, we talk about all the bad people out there that are carrying out these cyber attacks. The reality is that we're right up there, right? In terms of, our state doing this stuff. And it's not just the state, it's not government-sponsored hacking against a lot of these other countries. It's people within our own country, right? So it's not only a problem for us internationally, but it's a problem domestically as well that we have to start to take care of. Going back to that other map, the interesting thing is the 4 countries that are the top in terms of terrorism don't even show up on this list, right? So it's Iraq, number 1, Afghanistan, Nigeria, and Pakistan. Nowhere on here. We want to talk about what are their motivations. And this kind of breaks down, sets the stage for some of the things that I want to talk about a little bit later in the presentation. We can go through these. A lot of people have heard these terms already. People like white hat hackers, right? This is essentially what BTB Security does. We're one of those companies that provides hacking services essentially in advance, those proactive services. I always say that we're the good guys doing bad things to good people so that the bad guys don't do the bad things to the good people. Black hat hackers, these are the bad guys. Very, very generically, These people are doing it so that they get paid. There's some sort of financial motivation. Sometimes it's access. You have less people doing it for fun or to show that they can actually accomplish this type of stuff. Script kiddies, something that we'll talk about a little bit more as well. It's a derogatory term. It's for people that don't really have the necessary skills, but are reusing things like scripts and programs that are out there. We'll talk about the rise in this type of activity and why we've seen it. Hacktivists, more and more we've seen this. Who knows who Anonymous is? Again, everybody should raise their hand. You're all liars. Tom, they're all liars. But Anonymous is obviously doing it for political motivation, right? And they've made their point time and time again, whether it's an election, whether it's some sort of social issue, whatever it may be. The state-sponsored hackers. This is one of my favorite areas to talk about. This is kind of the biggest piece of this presentation. The new line is, he who controls cyberspace controls the world. And anybody that knows military history, right, it used to be land, then it was sea, then it was air. Now we've moved into a point where we have militaries very much focused on cyberspace. For everyone that has a military, the cost of entry is very low, right? So there are countries out there, our adversaries, that don't have air forces, right? We've had military superiority because of that. Here, cost of entry is a little bit lower. Depends on infrastructure, but it's something that we have to keep in mind. Spy hackers, believe it or not, these people are out there. So we talked a little bit about intellectual property and how that intellectual property plays into the top hackers or the top hacking nations that we saw. Even domestically, there are people out there that get paid and are hired, and we run into them all the time, that are essentially spy hackers. Companies retain their services. Obviously, it's not something that you put an RFP out for, but they retain their services to get information from other companies, whether it be intellectual property, customer lists, anything to give them the upper edge. It does happen, and we see it all the time. And then, of course, our cyber terrorists, right? Terrorism, obviously, it was more about meat space or the real physical world. Cyber terrorists, same sort of thing, right? They're out there to spread fear, terror, and doubt. They're just using cyber attacks to do that. So, talk about where people are attacking from, the types and the basic breakdowns of those attackers, and we can talk about different industries, and this is why we end up talking at so many different types of conferences across industries because it's applicable. And I'll just kind of roll through these. It's more of a demonstration of how impactful it is. Of course, you talk about financial services. It makes sense. That's where the money is. And that's where a lot of money has been spent in securing organizations. You get into things like nuclear reactors, materials, waste, government facilities, communications, water sources, IT. Again, pretty obvious. Access, continuing to spread that type of attack or use resources for other attacks. Emergency services has been a new one. Just in the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen a lot more large city police departments, fire departments. They have a lot of intelligence information, and they have access and control to plans that may tip people off. So we've seen a lot of spending in that arena. Chemical, manufacturing, dams, defense, industrial bases, the list goes on, right? Food and agriculture has been an interesting one. Healthcare has been out there for a long time. Is there anybody here from a hospital before I start talking about hospitals? Okay. Probably one of the more interesting areas. We all know that they have awesome information, right? They have PHI, protected health information, tons and tons of people. Unfortunately, they're very, very focused on patient care. And I say unfortunately from a perspective of security. Now for them, it's of the utmost importance. You're focused on the patient, those patient outcomes, making sure that people are taken care of. Technology has been a little bit of an afterthought. They've been able to implement it to make that patient care better and treat people in better ways. But in terms of security, even infrastructure, a little bit laggard. Spending money in those areas has been a real struggle for a lot of folks. And of course, transportation systems. Again, an interesting one when we talk about critical infrastructure. A lot of people don't think about how trains run and how they have to be secured. And when we talk about positive train control and tracking contents of a train across the country, how that ties into security. But you start to think about it, take those next steps in your mind, it is very impactful, and it is a piece of our critical infrastructure. There's not many things that fall outside of this list. There may be some very small things, but it's a pretty comprehensive list. So you start to talk about what are we worried about them attacking? It's pretty much everything, right? It's a little bit daunting. I'll keep clicking. All right. The new reality is that it isn't just an IT problem any longer. You know, you can't blame it on the IT guy. You can't blame it on your data center provider. It's just not real anymore. You need to go a little bit further than that, and it has to be an organizational discussion. Who's worried about it now? You know, we talked about the industries and how many industries are involved in it. Everybody, right? Even the executive management and the boards. We have been called in to talk about this stuff to more boardrooms in the past 5 years than, you know, I have in my entire history doing IT security. So it's kind of amazing. And they're not just asking the question about, are we protected and are we doing the right things? Are we spending our money in the right ways? They're actually asking very, very deep technical questions about not only their own stuff, but how they're stacking up against their competition and what they look like in the industry. So people are really involved now, which has been a change. And it's a serious issue. It's about time that everybody kind of woke up, started to take more responsibility in this. It's not just about technology, it's much more than that. So, what are we concerned about, right? All of the breaches. And as Oprah says, you get hacked, everybody gets hacked, right? Top of the mind is always, and I say we as in sort of the general public, and then we can talk about the industry more specifically. Everybody wants to talk about the breaches. And we'll get down into, you know, my thoughts on this in the next slide. First thing that's top of mind, right? When we go into Q&A, there's usually always somebody that asks about the latest breach, Equifax. What do I do? Or what's the impact? So it is out there. Like I said, it's top of mind for folks, and it's easy to talk about. Wait, I want to go back. Internet of Things is the next thing. You know, we talked about, or Tom had talked about in the upcoming sessions, connected buildings, I think it was, right? This falls right into that. Connected devices. Everybody has something in their house that has internet connectivity, whether it be an Alexa, right? That's storing 60 seconds of your information as you ask it questions, and it's building that database of what you're asking it, so that when you turn on your phone or turn on your computer, you're all of a sudden being targeted and, you know, being trying to solve the things that you were searching on. We talk about critical infrastructure. We've seen a pretty good increase in this. You know, some of the areas or industries that I touched on there kind of fall in that critical infrastructure, but people are actually talking about it. You know, how are we protecting our water systems? The latest one, kind of the big push, is how are we protecting our electrical grid, right? We're getting energy. How do we make sure and understand that it's actually protected from a malicious attacker trying to shut it down or do something with it? Hacktivism, again, taking the example of Anonymous. They're probably the largest and most well-known, but there are a lot of smaller groups out there that do the same stuff day in and day out, and it's something that people are starting to take notice of. There are a lot of people that are actually fans of Anonymous. And I get it. There are causes that are very compelling and they're very polarizing. Unfortunately, it's still a crime, right? It may seem innocuous, the type of attacks that they're pulling off, but they're still attacks, right? And then, of course, everybody hears about these new regulations, new terms that come up, things that, you know, essentially it's more letters, more government agencies, more hands in the pot to try to sort out what we need to do to really solve the security issues that we have in industry and then also that are affecting us personally. So are the concerns valid? It's a tough one, right? When we talk about breaches, yes, everyone should be concerned about the breaches that are happening. Just remember, the media tends to sensationalize things, right? They're there to provide a story and to get ratings and to keep their advertisers happy. So you can be concerned, I would say that you can be outraged, especially if you've lost your personal information or it's impacted your company in some way. The Internet of Things stuff, I love to put this up. I think it's the greatest spy ever. It was Hello Barbie, right, who was recording information. It was a kid's toy. It was the greatest spy ever invented, and it was something very innocuous. When we talk about the Internet of Things, we'll just lump it all together and say Internet of Things. We talk about things like nanny cams, kids' toys, refrigerators, toasters, coffee machines, whatever it may be. We've seen a pretty dramatic spike in how we're breaking into companies proactively through devices like this. So it is very impactful. The concerns are valid. We should make sure that we're actually taking care of that stuff. A lot of people are bringing these things into their environments, into their work environments, not really telling anybody that's involved in IT. Next thing you know, you have something connected to your infrastructure that is essentially a rogue access point or an entry point for something that, bad things that can happen. So as much as you focus on doing the right things in your own infrastructure, you could have somebody bring something in. I'm not gonna say that they're gonna bring in Barbies in. I know people that work for us might bring some Barbies in just to play with them, but the point is, these devices are out there, and they're kind of invading all of our infrastructures, and we have to be mindful of that. So there is a valid concern with that. The critical infrastructure, absolutely, right? We all know what we need to do and what we need to protect in terms of critical infrastructure. Financial services is kind of lumped into that critical infrastructure because it's impactful to all of us, right? If Bitcoin takes off and ruins our money-based market, we're gonna have issues, right? If we have something like our water systems infiltrated by an attacker and the systems don't clean out all the bad stuff, it's gonna be impactful. And like I said, even with the electrical grid, it can be very impactful to all of us. The unfortunate part is that even though it's considered a critical infrastructure, the protections around this stuff, they're not quite up to snuff yet. In financial services, there's a very real financial impact to those organizations. With critical infrastructure, it's always that threat. It's what if it's gonna happen. So it's kind of like business continuity, right? I know we've all been through that. You're trying to plan, you're trying to get budget for disaster recovery, and this kind of falls right in line with that. What do we need to do? How do we need to justify this? And then the last one, the new regulations, the hacktivism, the new regulations. I already talked about the hacktivism stuff. The new regulation stuff, it's a little bit frustrating. We should be concerned with how many there are. What I don't like about it, what we're seeing time and time again, is people reinventing the wheel. So we have a set of rules, something like PCI DSS for payment card industry, for credit cards essentially. On top of that, then you have another regulation that comes out. And then 6 months down the line, another regulation. All of a sudden you're dealing with 5 different regulations or industry-based standards, and you're one organization, you're basically chasing your tail, trying to check all of those boxes, but they're all essentially trying to do the same thing. Protect your organization, protect the valuable information that you have within your organization, customers you have, or personal information that you may be storing. So is our focus correct? Does anybody remember Homie the Clown, right? One of my favorite characters from In Living Color. So Homie don't play that. That's how I feel about it. The concern is good, but it should be more of an outrage. And I'm not saying that we all jump up, grab our torches, and march out to our respective industries, but it is frustrating for me. The hacks that we see time and time again, and something that I'll kind of touch on at the end of this slide, the hacks that we see time and time again are not that sophisticated. It's actually very frustrating. So everybody has in their mind, when we talk about doing penetration tests or responding to a breach or an incident and talking about it, the smoke and mirrors, the glamour that we've seen that's kind of come from Hollywood. Unfortunately, even something like the Equifax breach, I'm here to tell you, it was not that sophisticated. It was admin panels that weren't hidden with a password, username password combination of admin. Is that sophisticated? Not really. You got to know what you're looking for, but at the same time, that was one of the steps that was actually carried out in that Equifax breach. So it's a little bit disheartening, even spending 18 years in the industry, to talk about all these cool things that can be done and all these awesome hacks that we see and vulnerabilities and different exploits. It can get very technical, but unfortunately, a lot of the attacks that we're seeing are still very, very simple. It comes down to certain things like account controls, making sure that they're separated, right? Password controls, and just basic hygiene and cleanliness that goes along with IT infrastructure and companies in general. The piece about new terms, new letters, same issues, I already kind of touched on it. The big ones that have just come out or are coming out, it's kind of the threat of things that are going to come in the next year or so. New York Department of Financial Services, or NYDFS rules. Again, if you look at those rules, they're actually very, very simple. You need to be doing proactive security assessments. You need to be doing monitoring. You need to have somebody in place that's a security person. You need to have the capability to do incident response. There's nothing groundbreaking in that small set of things, right? It's a very small list. This is stuff that people have heard time and time again. I think the biggest problem that we're facing in the industry is the fact that we're still looking for teeth behind that. So the New York Department of Financial Services, while it's a state regulation, and they're really pushing it for financial services, it also impacts any companies that have any dealings with companies that are regulated within New York that it's impactful for. So it's a relatively small list, but it actually has a little bit more teeth to it. And they're going to be able to enforce fines, hopefully. Another big one that's going to be coming down the pike, people have probably already heard some rumblings on it, is GDPR, just coming out of the European Union. Really has to do more about personal privacy and how you store that information, how you deal with it, how it's transacted, who you give it to, and then also if it's exposed, what you need to do. Again, the biggest difference between the United States and the European Union is the fact that we look at it a little bit differently. We're more worried about companies and organizations and kind of that information getting out and how it's impactful. The European Union has really been focused on personal information and how it's impactful to privacy. We're a little bit more security-oriented. They're a little bit more privacy-oriented. You put the two things together, especially with something like GDPR, which again, it's impactful for the European Union, but it also is about any organization that touches anything in Europe. And guess what? It's pretty much everyone, right? We all have a customer or an organization that we deal with that is based in the European Union. So we all have to be thinking about this stuff. The fact that we've continued to reinvent this stuff is frustrating. And we hear it time and time again in our business. We get CISOs, CIOs, even CEOs that talk to us that talk about the fact that, they've dealt with PCI, and then 2 years later, they're dealing with the New York Department of Financial Services. One of the things that we preach, kind of taking a step back, talking about more of a framework-based approach to security, doing it once and making sure that you can continue to build upon it, right? So the next time some government agency decides to randomly put together some regulation and call it a new thing and everybody pats themselves on the back about it, you're ready for it. You make some small adjustments, make sure that you understand how it's impactful to your organization. If there's any gaps that you need to fill, those get filled, but ultimately you continue to build your security program and you're getting yourself a good base and more of a framework around it. And as I mentioned in that first bullet point, it's not the low-hanging fruit anymore that people are grabbing, that they're doing attacks on. I always like to call it it's the fruit on the ground. I mean, it is really frustrating to me when we go in and do a breach response that you talk about, well, what was the critical failure in terms of technology? And everybody wants to point at the technology. Sometimes it is a misconfiguration. Sometimes it's a user error. But the bottom line is, it's not a technology problem, but that fruit on the ground or the low-hanging fruit is the stuff that people are still not taking care of. It's the basic hygiene stuff, the password controls, the default settings that were never changed, no monitoring. It's still shocking to me that we aren't doing security monitoring more. There's a lot of folks that are doing operational monitoring, and you guys know them all, right? They want to make sure that everything's up and it's reliable. I mean, that's kind of what this forum is about, right? Reliability. And at the same time, worried about reliability and not so much focused on security. Security is part of that. It's absolutely part of that. So what are my biggest fears? Well, number one, squirrels, and that's why I put it up here. I can't stand them. I understand they're a rodent. They're probably very innocuous. I don't trust any animal that doesn't fit in my, or that is smaller than my hand. I think they're very dangerous, quite honestly, and that's why I put it up here. Infrastructure to me is, and when I'm not talking IT infrastructure, I'm talking about it more from the flip side. We talked about cyber terrorism, right? The infrastructure that we continue to build for folks who have historically been our adversaries, and we've done this before, right? We helped rebuild Japan. They're now an economic superpower that compete directly with the United States. They've given us some troubles. We're building infrastructure in places that foster a lot of people that don't like the United States. And that's lumping us in as a whole, as citizens, as organizations, as business people. We continue to build that infrastructure. I did that comparison on cyber attackers and the terrorist threat and where those people came from. I pointed out a couple different countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, and Pakistan. We are actively at this time building better infrastructure in all of those countries. So once the infrastructure is there, what do you think is going to happen? Right? We're leveling the playing field. We're actually working against ourselves, leveling the playing field, and giving people access to infrastructure that they've never had before. The terrorism nexus is going to change from, not that meat space attack and not the physical attacks. It's going to change into real cyber attacks. We have to make sure that we're prepared for it. Cost of entry has changed. Earlier I talked about the script kiddies, right? Basically just reusing people's programs. This has continued to build. There's more script kiddies out there pulling off attacks or trying to pull off attacks than there ever has been before. And with that fruit on the ground, you have folks actually getting access to things. They're unsophisticated in terms of themselves being actors, but the tools that are out there, the exploits, the scripts that are out there are actually more sophisticated now. So for somebody to go out, anybody can do it. Open up a Google search and type malware, creating malware. You'll have pages and pages of information of how you create malware or how you can create a ransomware piece and unleash it on the world. The cost of entry has definitely changed for folks. Better communication channels. Here to tell you, just like we have better communication channels and we do networking, right? We do networking face to face. The same thing happens in that underworld, right? It's not as shady, and we're not all wearing hoodies, and some people are wearing hoodies and they're a little bit shady, but the communication channels have gotten better and better for those folks out there. There's an amount of this that people tap into, and it's kind of a gray area. Ourselves as a company, we look at this stuff all the time. It's that dark web stuff, right? Making sure that we're capturing the type of things that go on and already hearing, kind of pre-hearing some of the attacks that are being planned, how they're being pulled off, just basically getting information. And I know the government does the same thing. But there's more chatter around carrying out attacks and how to carry them out than we've ever seen before, and it's something pretty scary. And the other part that I always like to bring up, there's no honor among thieves. It's also, it's awesome, but at the same time very scary to sit and look at the breaches that we've worked in terms of just flat out incident response or data breaches, that there's handoffs between folks depending upon what their actual methodologies, but then also what their focus is. So we've seen an attack maybe originate from somebody in China where they were trying to get information, get a foothold into an organization, and gain access to use the resources. And then they sell that access to somebody in Eastern Europe. And the nexus changes. They're not worried about just access or intellectual property. They're worried about extorting that company or somehow pulling money out of it. And then it changes hands again, and they sell it to hacktivists, somebody like Anonymous, who may use it for resources to attack another company, or they may use it to extort that particular company or organization, whatever it may be. There is no honor among thieves. You can't trust. People are still out there scamming each other. But in this community, kind of in this, in this cyber criminal area or arena, you see actual marketplaces of things changing hands, whether it's access to resources, whether it's pieces of malware that are reused or manufactured to carry out some specific attack. They're out there, and it's actively happening all the time. So that persistent access and kind of the handoff of attacks for different reasons is absolutely happening. So what can we do? Great movie, Gladiator, right? Whatever comes out, we got a better chance of survival if we work together. And this is one of the things that I really do like to talk about in every group, because we're all part of this. It's not just an IT problem. It's an organizational problem that we all kind of need to face. Information sharing, doing things like this, I absolutely love it, right? The groups that get together, even if they're not security focused, to talk about different ideas, sit down at the coffee break, cocktail hour, do it at cocktail hour. Lips might be a little bit looser, talk a little bit more freely about some of the things that you do in your organization, but it's information sharing. How have we taken care of something? How have we looked at a problem and maybe solved it for our clients, and how's it applicable to somebody else's industry? Defensive transparency. This is something that, up until a few years ago, a lot of people didn't want to do. They didn't want to talk about what their defense mechanisms were. They didn't want to talk about how they did monitoring, because they thought they were giving up that information. The reality is, we all know we're doing it, right? There's a lot of companies that I can approach and just say, have you done a security assessment? And if somebody goes, no, well, you're in a world of hurt then, or you're lying to me. Everybody's proactively done this stuff. It's on the top of mind for organizations. So we know that you're doing security assessments. We know that you're doing monitoring or thinking about doing monitoring. We know you should do that stuff. Talking about how you're defending yourself isn't really giving up secrets, because everybody is going to tweak it and obviously make it their own for the organization, but it's sharing that knowledge and just talking about what we need to do. It's also good for your partners, right? Sitting down and talking about what you're doing differently, just to make sure that you guys are on the same page. So if you're doing 24/7 monitoring on security and you have an incident response plan in place, talk about it, right? You may have partners that want to utilize your services or partner with you to make sure that if they're having an issue, they can actually call you and kind of give you that pre-warning about the things that they're seeing. Offensive privatization. This has already been a topic in the United States government. I think you're going to see a big change in the coming years. We've already pushed, obviously because of the need for private organizations, for a big defensive push. We've now kind of flipped the switch a little bit. You have the United States government that's actively going out and attacking our adversaries, the people that are attacking us, preemptively attacking them. It's going to happen in the private industry as well. No longer are we going to be able to just sit on our hands and say, okay, we're going to defend against everything. But when we find somebody that's attacking us, why should there be rules about us turning the tables and attacking them, right? There's a very fine line, though. What are the rules of engagement? How far do we go? And this is, I think, like I said, going to be a topic that a lot of folks are going to wrestle with in the next 5 to 10 years. But trust me, it is coming down the pike. And then another big thing that I always talk about in trying to tackle the quote-unquote security problem is erasing the legitimate talent deficit. I maintain that we're working off about a 20-year talent deficit in this industry. And while there's a lot of good training out there, and there are very eager people to jump into security or want to get into the industry, that legitimate talent is hard to find. We spend a lot of time in our organization trying to find the right people so that they can consult to organizations. Those organizations, time and time again, when we talk to them, are really struggling to find leaders for their own companies, but then also the technicians to be able to carry out this work. I always get asked, what's the perfect security person? I don't know. I can tell you who we've hired and how we've hired them, but I can also give you examples of where they came from that will completely boggle your mind. We have biochemists. We have, people that have history backgrounds. I don't know. A lot of times it comes down to aptitude and just work experience. A lot of people are hard workers and they get the certifications behind it, but is it legitimate talent? It's very hard to say. That's something that has to be developed. So, covered a lot of different things. I'll leave you with one quote and then we'll jump into Q&A. A friend of mine, the name, goes back. He was actually a government employee, but it's kind of an interesting quote just to talk about cyber attacks and, really what the government's doing from a former insider's view. It's Eric O'Neill. The federal government has no national plan to address a catastrophic cyber attack or even when to consider a cyber attack in the same way we might consider a kinetic or physical attack. In light of this fact, businesses and private citizens cannot rely on the government to solve our cybersecurity problems. Preventing these attacks, detecting them more accurately, and responding to them quickly continue to be the key to healthy cybersecurity. The government won't be sending any white knights to save us anytime soon. So you can rely on the government, or at least we can pretend and walk through security theater when we're at the airport and things like that, to rely on them for those physical, typical terrorist attacks. But in terms of cybersecurity, while the government used to be at the top of the game, they're not there anymore. The burden is on us as organizations and as individuals to take this seriously and actually do something about it. So with that, thank you very much for the time. Open it up to Q&A. Not sure if there's a microphone or anything to pass around. It's a good enough size room. No questions, even about the squirrels? Nothing?
I have one.
Okay.
All right, so this is a data center audience in here. And let's say somebody has data center operations where they keep some enterprise applications in their own facility and they outsource the rest of their applications to another facility, a colo, the cloud, whatever. What are the top three differences in a security approach that you would recommend? It's one company, but their operations are spread out in two different types of facilities. One they control, and one they don't necessarily control. Where would you start in your consultation with them?
With the one that they control, you can obviously have more strict standards and actually a framework-based approach to what you're doing and kind of how you're doing it. So the control is always there. We've seen a lot of people move to that outsource model, either using a provider. Even ourselves, we're actually a tier point customer. So tier point, I'm not sure where the person is in the room, but we're a tier point customer. We have our own internal systems, and then we use tier point for the bulk of our operations and what we provide. And then we do have things in the cloud, AWS, right? And then rack space for different purposes. Everybody finds a reason to use those other providers. Sounds like a jungle's going on next door. In implementing what we do and kind of how we do it, I'll give you our perspective and then what we tell our clients. It's always very much focused on the business, and we take a business-friendly approach to everything. You're gonna use other providers because it makes sense for your business. You're not in business to be the most secure. You're in business to make money or provide a service, whatever it may be. For your other providers, just know what they do. Know what they do in security. I feel like I should dance off the stage now. Know what they do about security. So don't be afraid to ask the hard questions, right? And we've talked about third-party risk management. This is great. Third-party risk management. I can't mariachi. I can't do that, or salsa dance. Don't be afraid to ask the tough questions about how they handle security, not only in their organizations, but then also the partner organizations that they have kind of downstream. We've seen a big increase in that, those third-party risk assessments, and I am positive everybody in the room has either sent a third-party risk questionnaire or risk assessment, or actually received them and tried to deal with the questions that come out of that stuff. How are you doing security? How are you doing monitoring? Right on down the line. It takes a lot of time. It's a pain, but it's a necessary evil right now. So I think the biggest thing to answer that question is to know your vendors, know your partners, understand their security, and own it. right? It's not just about your own infrastructure, but the money that you're spending and the vendors that you have to understand and believe in their security as well.
Any other questions?
It's like an entire movie soundtrack wrapped up in one.
So I actually have two questions. The first is, notoriously, the biggest threat that people have is the insider threat. So my first question is around, do you do any special background checking? Do you recommend that there be any special kind of background checking or undercurrent type of monitoring tools that would show if there was some funky, activity going on? The second is really not a question, but asking for you to make a statement around compliance and what that means to us as data center managers. We traditionally look at the physicality of the data center. More and more we're being asked to have some level of accountability for what's on the devices that reside in the data center. So if you could speak to compliance at all, that would be great.
Okay, that was a lot.
And I talk really fast.
Yeah, and I got most of it over the soundtrack. So let me hit on the compliance piece first, and then we'll go back to the other question. Compliance is a necessary evil, like I talked about. There's new things coming out all the time, and you have to check those boxes. But, again, you guys have probably heard this time and time again, just be aware that compliance doesn't equal security. So even in something that I think is a really good approach to a security framework, something like PCI, specifically around credit card data, how many people have suffered a credit card hack? A lot of organizations. So is it perfect? Absolutely not. So be mindful of the compliance activities that go on. My recommendation is to always take those compliance initiatives and be opportunistic about that. Make sure that you're bringing in real security to actually base or work on those compliance issues, but also put yourselves in a better place for security. Because it's the time to do that. You're getting everybody's ear. You have that executive buy-in and the visibility when you talk about compliance or you see compliance. And a lot of your partners and vendors and customers are going to ask about it. Use that as an opportunity to do that. Use that as an opportunity to bring security into the organization or make it better. On the first question with the insider threat, I actually do a whole presentation on the insider threat and how it's dealt with. It has grown pretty dramatically over the years, and it's something that a lot of people focus on. Vetting employees is of utmost importance, but we still know that people can become bad actors even if they were good people. So you can do your background checks. You can hope for the best in terms of getting the right people in the job. My big thing around that is just to be doing that continuous monitoring. So you want to trust your folks to be able to do the job that they need to do, but you also need to realize that they can be, a victim of finding their own opportunities to do bad things as well. So making sure that you're not only monitoring from an outsider perspective, but also monitoring comprehensively so that if there is some sort of insider threat, if people are trying to exfiltrate data, if they're trying to steal compliance lists, you can actually catch that as well. So Tom's giving me the cutoff signal. I'm being played off the stage as well. Not anymore. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.